Hi, everyone. Welcome to Champion Briefs News for Thursday, September 18th, 2014. My name is Joe Russell, and we're coming to you live this week, hopefully to try and get a lot of you ready for the Yale tournament that's coming up this weekend, as well as just to give you some background about what all's going on in the news throughout this week, and there's certainly been a lot of it. We want to start off where we've started off the past few weeks, which is with developments that have come out of the Islamic State of Iraq and Syria, more commonly referred to as ISIS. Now, to start off, I really want to highlight a cool resource that a lot of you extempors and congressional debaters could utilize. This week, the New York Times put up a cool graphic where they actually explain lots about how the Islamic State actually works in a lot of its leadership capacity. So I'm going to go over some of that background so we have a good understanding of exactly how this state works so that you can use it going forward when you're giving extemp speeches or talking about ISIS, as you, I'm sure, will in congressional debate. So what's interesting, New York Times explains this on September 16th, that the leadership is Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi, which we've heard a lot about both from President Obama and in the news over the past few weeks. But it turns out he's not just ruling ISIS on his own in the same way that somebody like Osama bin Laden was pretty much unilaterally controlling al-Qaeda. In fact, he's advised by kind of a group of a leadership council who kind of serve as direct, or who have direct access to him, and are then able to both also make sure that his orders are executed perfectly. They guarantee that any religious differences that emerge between ISIS are handled, so on and so forth. Now, below that leadership council is a cabinet who actually handles a lot of the basic, bureaucratic issues that ISIS has to deal with now that they actually control a substantial amount of territory. So there are cabinet positions for finance, security, media, prisoners, recruitment. Those are some of the categories that the CIA at least knows about right now. Then below them, there's at least a dozen deputies who serve as kind of regional governors, as it were, in different areas of Iraq and Syria as well. They kind of deal with the local issues and then report up to the cabinet and ultimately up to Baghdadi. So there really is an interesting bureaucratic element to exactly how ISIS is working. Now, the other really unique thing about ISIS going forward is that ISIS actually has a substantial amount of wealth as well. Now, one of the things you need to remember about other terrorist groups is they often operate on a shoestring budget. They don't have that much funding to actually be able to carry out terrorist attacks. That's not true with ISIS, at least over the past few months, because they've managed to take over a substantial number of oil fields in both Iraq and Syria, which has given them a lot of resources that they can use to both funnel money into the fighters that they're using to purchase more weapons so that they can actually continue to attack both states in Syria and government forces within Iraq. In fact, it's estimated that they have the Omar oil field, which is in Syria. That's the largest oil field in Syria. They've controlled that since July, and that produces about 30,000 barrels of oil per day. They've also, in the past few months in Iraq, seized several of the oil fields up in the north. That total produces 25 to 40,000 barrels of oil a day. That's estimated to be $1 million every single day that ISIS is getting as a result of their oil revenue. They're getting a massive amount of money, which then allows ISIS to and more oil going, or which allows ISIS to purchase more and more money, or purchase more and more resources going forward that they can actually use to both fight the states of Iraq and Syria. Now, another interesting thing is the CIA's current estimate is that there's about 20,000 to 31,000 troops within Iraq and Syria fighting on behalf of ISIS. And they estimate that about 15,000 of them, about half of the total fighters who are fighting for ISIS, are foreign fighters. And they point out that a lot of the weapons and especially military transport vehicles that are being used by ISIS are largely coming from the Iraqi army, and many times were actually, at one point or another, used by the United States. In other words, it's really interesting that ISIS is getting a lot of their resources both by selling oil on the black market through countries like Turkey, but they're also being able to use lots of resources that the United States provided originally to the Iraqi army during U.S. involvement in Iraq. Now, unfortunately, there have been some fairly substantial developments when it comes to what ISIS has done over the past few weeks as well. That starts off with what The Guardian reports on September 14, 2014, that a British citizen, David Haines, was actually beheaded this week in yet another ISIS video, similar to the way that the 2 Americans have been executed in previous weeks. The video on this, or the message on this video, was that David Cameron, the British Prime Minister, should try and avoid alliances with the United States, the warning being that if he didn't do this, then more British citizens who are being held hostage by ISIS would also be executed in a similar way that we've seen in the past. Now, another interesting development, though, came earlier today. Reuters explains on September 18, 2014, that another British journalist and hostage of ISIS, John Cantalil, actually released a video from ISIS today, but instead of him being potentially threatened, or his life being threatened, or him being beheaded, what the video showed was Cantalil saying that he was going to, quote, soon reveal facts about the group to counter its portrayal in Western media. He said that there would be a series of programs indicating that he's going to try and do some kind of web series, at least is what it appears like right now, explaining the internal workings of ISIS from a journalist perspective. It appears then that this is some form of ISIS trying to be able to broaden its outreach to at least more Islamic militants and more Islamic extremists around the world, and to try and present a different image of itself. We'll have to stay tuned to see exactly what happens with these broadcasts, but it appears that ISIS is starting to at least use its hostages for something other than execution examples to try and deter action from the West. Now, based on all of this going on right now, there's a few questions that we should really be asking about these all of these executions. First, is the killing of a United Kingdom citizen going to deter Britain from actually helping the U.S. in their coalition? That's unlikely to happen, as British Prime Minister David Cameron has already committed to helping the United States going forward. But an interesting element that we should think about when it comes to the United Kingdom and their action going forward is the Scottish referendum. If David Cameron, who's being accused by many of the Scots, continues to use British foreign policy too aggressively, he could fear, at least in the past week, that by him taking this kind of action, he's actually going to try and push the Scots further away from the United Kingdom. That may be why in the past week, Mr. Cameron's military response and coalition has actually been dialed down. That's something that we'll have to watch in the next week after the Scottish referendum's actually over. Also, an interesting question that needs to be asked about the United Kingdom, specifically when it comes to hostages, is about ransom payments. Now, you'll remember that the United States has a very, very clear policy that we don't pay ransom to terrorist organizations. Now, Britain has that same commitment on paper, but unlike the United States, they don't always commit to it. If one British citizen has been killed, could the British government potentially be allowing more of its citizens to actually, or could be allowing many of the families, or actually the government itself, to start paying ransom to ISIS to try and guarantee that more British citizens aren't killed? This is something we're going to have to keep an eye on going forward when it comes to ISIS. Staying on the topic of ISIS, though, the United States has also begun to roll out President Obama's strategies for taking a more aggressive action towards ISIS, like we talked about last week. The New York Times explains on September 16, 2014, that President Obama on Saturday strikes since the announcement of the more aggressive campaign against ISIS, this time targeting some military forces who are members of ISIS near Baghdad, which was an attempt to try and simply help the Iraqi government gain territory against ISIS. This is interesting because it was the first strike when the president wasn't either acting to try and protect American interests or to try and guarantee that humanitarian assistance was provided. A clear indication of exactly what President Obama hopes to do with airstrikes going forward. Also, this week, General Martin Dempsey, who's the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, and Chuck Hagel, the Secretary of Defense, were both testifying in front of the Senate when they made some interesting statements about the future of U.S. plans going forward. Politico explains on September 16, 2014, that General Martin Dempsey said on Tuesday that he would advise President Obama to use U.S. ground troops against the Islamic State of Iraq and the Levant, ISIL or ISIS, if their current strategy is unsuccessful. That seems to indicate that, at least in the eyes of the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff and the Secretary of Defense, troops aren't fully off the table, which is an interesting indication of exactly what Plan B seems to exist, or maybe doesn't exist, for the Obama administration going forward. That's especially important considering the responses that came to General Dempsey's statement. First, the Associated Press explained on September 17, 2014, that Haider al-Abadi, who's the new Prime Minister of Iraq, said point blank that he did not want U.S. troops on the ground actually fighting alongside Iraqi forces. That's interesting because it appears that the Iraqi Prime Minister himself is taking U.S. troops off the table. An interesting position for somebody who has lost control of half of his current state right now. Given that, though, it's interesting that the Iraqis are taking U.S. troops off the table, and the Associated Press again explains that this morning, President Obama again reaffirmed his commitment to not putting troops on the ground either. That begs an interesting question, though. If President Obama's military advisors seem to think that their plan B is sending in troops to try and defeat ISIS, and President Obama is saying he rejects that plan B, is there an actual plan B in place if President Obama's current strategy fails? Also, is this beginning to show cracks in the coalition if Iraq and the United States aren't on the same page about what the ultimate strategy is when it comes to defeating ISIS and how much assistance from the United States can be given in total to ultimately defeat ISIS and how much the Iraqis want to control on their own? This shows interesting transitions, or this shows an interesting relationship both between the president and some of his military advisors and between the United States and Iraq. Speaking of President Obama's strategy, though, some good news did come out of Congress this week, as the New York Times explains on September 15, 2014, that the House voted on Tuesday to approve President Obama's request for establishing training camps in Saudi Arabia to try and train moderate Syrian groups. The vote was set 273 to 156, crossing party lines. Interestingly, though, it was supported by both members of both Republicans and Democrats, and specifically by the leaders of both of those parties, John Boehner and Nancy Pelosi. And even better news on this front is that the Senate also approved all of the training camps just a few minutes ago, actually about an hour ago from right now. They approved this on a vote of 73 to 22, again crossing party lines. But in both of these chambers, opponents have said that they really don't want to trust President Obama to get the United States more involved, and many of them express concerns about trusting states like Syria, the Free Syrian Army, or Saudi Arabia going forward to try and be really the people who lead the charge against ISIS going forward. Interestingly, then, that there's so much bipartisan support for these plans, but there's also a lot of bipartisan opposition. Politico explains on September 16, 2014, that there's also been some interesting developments when it comes to President Obama's coalition. Now, they explain that there are some disadvantages that President Obama faces when it comes to getting the United States ready to get involved in Iraq again. And that's interesting because, as the article explains, the United States in the past 20 years has gotten seriously militarily involved in Iraq in two previous instances, under George H.W. Bush and under George W. Bush. The article, though, explains that the U.S. has several disadvantages this time that we didn't have in those previous two instances of getting involved within Iraq. First, they point out that this time the United States is weary of the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, whereas in both 2003 and in 1991, the United States was much more energized to actually get involved in the Middle East, meaning that war weariness wasn't a factor that either of the presidents Bush had to deal with. It also explains that in 1991 and 2003, the United States had much better ties with Russia, which is interesting, but it's a fascinating point as well, pointing out that Russia not working as closely with the United States in this era, in the current, right now, given the tensions that exist due to the crisis in Ukraine, actually means that Russia could block any major UN action to try and support the US's coalition going forward. An interesting development that you might not think of, but that is significant when it comes to this involvement in Iraq as compared to previous ones. A third thing they point out is that boots on the ground weren't ever ruled out in either 1991 or in 2003. In fact, in both instances, they were pretty encouraged. Given that, then, the United States doesn't instill nearly as much fear in those who were trying to attack, in this case not Saddam Hussein, but in the case of ISIS, they clearly know the U.S. limitations, whereas the previous two times the U.S. has gotten involved in Iraq, there haven't been as clear limitations as to how far the U.S. would or wouldn't go. Finally, an interesting note is that Saudi Arabia has been critical to the United States in all of these conflicts, but this time they're in a very different role than they have been in the previous two times the U.S. has gotten involved in Iraq. In the previous two times, Saudi Arabia was simply acting as its own sovereign state actor, a place where the U.S. could stage troops. That's different this time. Now Saudi Arabia is acting essentially as the bastion of hope, the leader amongst all Sunni Muslims around the world. That's significant because it means that their actions going forward when working with the United States or not working with the United States, those actions could be very different going forward. And that ultimately means that the United States needs to have a fundamentally different relationship with Saudi Arabia going forward. Now, we talked about oil revenues a little earlier and about how ISIS is essentially getting millions of dollars a day due to black market oil deals that they're able to make as a result of controlling major oil fields in both Iraq and Syria. Now, the Christian Science Monitor explains on September 16, 2014, that the main way that ISIS is smuggling all of this oil out of Iraq and Syria is they've got an established black market network which goes from northern Iraq and northern Syria into Turkey. They explained that this network was actually originally set up in 1989 when the United States began to impose sanctions on the Iraqi regime to try and guarantee that Saddam Hussein would be choked out of trying to continue to develop weapons of mass destruction. Whether or not those sanctions worked is up for debate, but what's interesting is that established a network which is still in place today. That means that the United States should really watch, or that means that if the United States wants to continue to fight ISIS, we really need to take out this well-established network that ISIS is currently using. The Christian Science Monitor says there are really two ways the United States could do this. First, the U.S. could try and use drones and airstrikes to target oil tankers as they move through both Iraq and Syria, trying to guarantee that ISIS can't actually take this oil into Turkey where it can be sold. Or they explained that that U.S. could also target the refineries in both Iraq and Syria that ISIS controls. The obvious disadvantage of that is that once, or presumably, the Iraqi or Syrian government retakes those refineries, they'll be destroyed, meaning that it'll be much harder for Iraq, which is free of ISIS, to actually sell oil to countries around the world, including the United States. The third thing that we need to remember about ISIS, though, is essentially how they're working to try and help fight ISIS, or is that the coalition that President Obama is establishing to try and fight ISIS. There have been some interesting relationships that have been developed and emerged in the past few weeks as President Obama has tried to put together this coalition. Now, there's been no more interesting relationship than the relationship between the United States and Iran. Now, the New York Times reports on September 15, 2014, that Secretary of State John Kerry held a conference amongst the entire coalitions working to fight against ISIS in Paris this past Monday. Notably, though, he didn't invite anyone from the Iranian government to take part in those discussions. That apparently deeply offended many in Iran, and thus the Iranians actually refused to continue to work with the United States. Interestingly, the Iranian Ayatollah and Supreme Leader Ali Khamenei made a statement saying that he would no longer work with the United States when it came to any issues dealing with the Middle East. That's a very strong statement, and interestingly, from the Supreme Leader. And it prompted backlash not just from Iran, but also from Iraq. Haider al-Abadi, the prime minister, again criticized Mr. Kerry for for not including Iran in the discussions of the coalition, and he said it was deeply disturbing that Iran wouldn't be working with the rest of the international community to defeat ISIS. Now, this begs a few questions. First, should the United States read anything into the fact that Mr. al-Abadi is pretty willing to criticize the United States fairly openly? Does this mean that the United States can't expect as close a relationship between Mr. al-Abadi as the United States did under Nouri al-Maliki, his predecessor as the prime minister? But secondly, when it comes to Iran, there are a few interesting developments. First, remember that Iran is has the largest Shiite Muslim population in the world. And because ISIS is a Sunni-affiliated group, many of the Shiites in Iraq, who Iran has often pledged that they have the authority to defend in the past, are going to be under threat, meaning that Iran theoretically has a very compelling interest to work with the United States and to get involved in fighting ISIS. The fact that Iran isn't working with the United States then is interesting, given the historical significance of their involvement and their pretty strong opposition to ISIS as well. But another more broad implication for foreign policy could be the fact that the United States going forward might actually see its relations with Iran on other things, most specifically talks when it comes to nuclear proliferation and Iran stopping to develop its nuclear weapons, could also begin to destabilize, especially if it's the supreme leader of Iran who's making announcements on behalf of the Iranian government. Really quick to overview how Iran's government works. Remember, they have a president. His name is Hassan Rouhani, and that president is elected democratically by the people, but he's also answerable to the supreme leader of Iran. As a result, most of the time what happens is the president of Iran makes most public statements, and at least is the public face of Iran. Only in times of great crisis or new policy decisions made by Iran does the supreme leader actually come forward and make announcements himself. That's why it's interesting that the Ayatollah is making statements and not Mr. Rouhani. That may indicate that the moderate wave that swept Mr. Rouhani into office may be ending, and may indicate that going forward, the United States shouldn't expect to be able to cooperate as much with Iran as we thought on a vast number of issues, not the least of which is ISIS. Finally, when we're talking about ISIS, another country who's tentative to work with the United States is the country of Turkey. The Financial Times explains on September 16, 2014, that the new president of Turkey, Recep Tayyip Erdogan, recently ruled out working with the United States and the Grand Coalition as well, claiming that they feared that if they worked too closely with the United States, many of the Turkish hostages who were being held by ISIS would be executed similarly to the way that many American and British hostages have been killed. However, Turkey is taking steps to at least try and guarantee that ISIS isn't able to spread further into Turkey. They plan to create an armed presence along their border with Iraq and Syria, essentially creating a buffer zone that guarantees that ISIS won't actually be able to move into Turkey and try and take over that area as well, which is when it comes to ISIS, because it means that their territorial spread will at least stop at Turkey's border. But Turkey's also announced that they plan to provide more humanitarian assistance to those who are affected by ISIS, and they're trying to set up a no-fly zone in the region that ISIS is controlling right now, which could mean that there's some air support coming from Turkey as well. They're just not working closely with the United States. Unfortunately, the one interesting thing that's come out of Turkey over the past few weeks is they've flat out denied the fact that they're actually taking part in or that they're actually playing any role at all in the black market smuggling of oil that's currently funding ISIS. That's interesting because most international experts agree it's going through Turkey because for the past 20 years, the black market has gone through Turkey. As a result of Turkey's denying that they have any responsibility to try and stop these black market deals, it could mean that it's much harder for the United States and for the U.S. coalition to try and actually stop the sale of this oil. And if those oil fields continue to be controlled by ISIS, it could mean that stopping ISIS becomes much, much harder. So that's everything that's going on with ISIS right now, but obviously stay up to date on everything that goes on with the situation because pretty obviously it changes pretty rapidly, and every week we have lots of new news to report. But let's move to another international crisis that fortunately hasn't flared up that much over the past week. And that's the that's the conflict between Ukraine and Russia. Now, remember that a ceasefire was put into effect last week, which theoretically guaranteed that the Russian rebel groups who were in the cities of Donetsk and Luhansk were putting down their weapons, going to stop fighting the Ukrainian government. Now, that sort of has happened. But the Associated Press explains on September 13, 2014, that over this past weekend, Ukrainian forces had to again repel attacks from Russian-aligned rebels as they attacked the airport in Donetsk, and then on Sunday, 6 more rebels were killed after they opened fire on Ukrainian troops again in Donetsk, indicating that while the ceasefire at least is on paper still in place, it appears that it's not being fully followed by many of the Russian separatist groups who believe that Ukraine should actually be a part of Russia. This means that going forward, actually enforcing the ceasefire could be much harder. Now, there's also another interesting development in that Ukraine has finally decided to move somewhat closer towards the EU. The BBC explains on September 17, 2014, that Ukrainian President Petro Poroshenko signed a Ukraine-EU trade deal, which is the same trade deal that his predecessor, Viktor Yanukovych, who was overthrown in February, refused to sign. But the Associated Press explains on September 12 that there were a few caveats when Mr. Poroshenko signed this deal. Namely, that Ukraine is going to keep its current tariffs in place against all EU goods until at least 2016. The reason for that's pretty simple. Russia point-blank told Poroshenko that if he actually lowered his tariffs on European goods right away, Russia would cut off all trade with Ukraine, which would obviously destroy Ukraine's economy. As a result, Poroshenko has negotiated with the Europeans to guarantee that Ukraine's tariffs are in place right now. But as a result of Ukraine signing this new trade deal, they're going to be making some substantial economic and political reforms that are required for them to become closer with the EU and theoretically put them on a path to ultimately joining the EU in a few years. The question is obviously whether or not Mr. Putin in Russia is going to actually allow Ukraine to move much closer towards the EU, meaning that the signing of this trade deal could be questionable going forward. Another interesting point, though, is that the United States and EU, even though the ceasefire is held, have still continued to tighten sanctions against Mr. Putin. Last Thursday, Bloomberg reported that the US and EU plan to deepen existing sanctions against Russia. They're going to continue their ban on food imports into Europe, as well as place substantial limitations on the financial transactions that will occur between Russia and the West. And that's interesting because it appears that these sanctions are beginning to have an effect on Russia. In fact, Reuters explained on September 16, 2014, that the former Russian finance minister, Alexei Kurndin, recently warned that Russia is currently at risk of falling into a recession as a result of the Western sanctions. The reason because of this, he says, is not because of the sanctions themselves, but because Mr. Putin's government hasn't invested enough money into the Russian economy to counter these sanctions. This seems to indicate really two things that send contradictory messages. First, it appears that the West's sanctions are working on Russia, but it also indicates that if Russia decides to be more proactive, they can avoid many of the repercussions that come as a result of these sanctions that the West is currently placing on them. Meaning that if Mr. Putin decides to actually put in place more programs that allow them to guarantee that their economy is much more stable going forward, then that guarantees that the Western sanctions will be much less effective and have much less of an impact on Russia going forward. Another international crisis that we've seen develop over the past few weeks is the Ebola crisis. Now, Reuters explains that as of today, there have been 5,357 people infected with Ebola, and of those, 2,630 have died, again still about a 50% mortality rate. These are according to World Health Organization numbers as of today. Now, what's interesting about this Ebola virus is really two things that we've realized. First is that it takes about twice as long for the current Ebola virus that's spreading right now to kill people who are infected, which is interesting compared to how long it's taken to kill people as a result of Ebola in previous infections. It currently takes about 21 days for a person who's infected with Ebola to begin to show symptoms and die. That means that one person, once they're infected, can spread the virus much more than they could in the past. Another interesting development is the fact that the Ebola virus has spread to major urban cities, which means that its ability to spread has increased dramatically. Unfortunately, that's led agencies like the United Nations to become very worried about the ability of these African countries to actually deal with the infections going forward. In fact, the New York Times explains on September 16, 2014, that the UN recently issued a report saying that they would need at least $1 billion more to be able to respond to the ever-increasing Ebola outbreak. The UN plan right now is to try and deal with at least 20,000 cases of Ebola, though the recent estimates from the United Nations say that they expect that the number of people infected with Ebola is going to go beyond 20,000 individuals. That would be a record-breaking number of people infected with Ebola, and indicates just how long this crisis could actually go on, meaning that we aren't anywhere near out of the woods yet. Now, fortunately, the United States has stepped up to answer the EU's call, or to answer the UN's call, excuse me. The New York Times explained on September 15, 2014, that the U.S. committed to make 17 Ebola treatment centers located throughout Western Africa, which would be able to house 1,700 individuals at a time. This is a substantial increase from what the United States has done in the past. Plus, President Obama announced this week that he's going to be sending in 3,000 U.S. troops who will be able to take charge of the U.S.-led assistance efforts in these regions, as well as to try and help the World Health Organization deal with this crisis generally. This does indicate that the United States is taking a much more proactive role when it comes to dealing with the Ebola crisis, but as of yet, it appears that the United States hasn't actually been able to make substantial progress in fighting the Ebola outbreak, and many experts say that 3,000 troops won't be enough to actually stem the tide of Ebola infections. Now, of course, the biggest news that's come today is specifically Scottish independence, and this is a live developing news story, but unfortunately, as of right now, we don't know whether or not Scotland is going to stay in the United Kingdom or whether they're ultimately going to leave. What we do know right now is what the Telegraph explains on September 18, 2014, that last night, the largest poll of Scots that's been conducted throughout the entire referendum process was conducted. And as a result of that poll, which polled 3,200 people in Scotland, they found that 48% of Scots were in favor of independence, whereas 52% were opposed to Scottish independence. Now, essentially what we're seeing right now is that the votes have been cast and collected right now, but an announcement isn't going to be made until later tonight or tomorrow as a result of exactly what's going on with Scottish independence. But it does appear that based on the latest poll numbers, these are poll numbers that I'm telling you, not actual election results, that people polled in Scotland appear to be trending more towards in favor of remaining in the United Kingdom than opposed. But obviously, you should stay tuned to the news. We expect that sometime tomorrow morning, at the very latest, we will know whether or not the Scots decided to stay in the United Kingdom or whether they decided to actually ultimately leave and form their own country. Just so you have context for both, though, going to tournaments this weekend, let's just talk about what a yes or no would mean. The New York Times explains on September 15, 2014, that if Scotland votes yes, what will happen is they'll go into an 18-month transition period where Scotland will officially become an independent nation in March of 2016. Of course, the consequences, which I talked about a little bit in my video last week, are going to be really enormous for both Scotland and the United Kingdom. For Scotland, they could risk losing the pound and having to join the much more unstable euro currency if they actually want to continue to have a functioning economy, which they probably do. But the UK is also going to face numerous problems, namely that they'll have to relocate all of their nuclear warheads, which are currently located in Scotland, to somewhere else. And let's remember, the UK doesn't have a ton of territory where they can just put nuclear warheads if you exclude Scotland. Plus, there are going to be unstoppable economic and numerous political repercussions for both Britain and Scotland going forward, meaning that if Scotland does decide to vote yes, we'll see a pretty strong period of instability when it comes to Britain going forward. Now remember, if they vote no, the New York Times also explains that none of these problems are going to be created for either the Scots or for the rest of the United Kingdom, but Scotland is going to be guaranteed more autonomy because the British Parliament has promised that they'll give more authority to the Scottish Parliament and to the regional parliament, guaranteeing that Scotland will have more control and more autonomy over its own affairs going forward, even if they decide not to leave the United Kingdom. Now, the Telegraph also explains this as of this evening, actually just a few hours ago, that Alex Salmond, who's the Scottish First Minister, has claimed that regardless of the results of the Scottish referendum, 99% of his constituency will be, quote, perfectly happy with the outcome of the referendum, whatever it is. This seems to be hinting at the problem that many are saying could exist going forward after the result of the Scottish independence. Let's say that even if Scotland decides not to leave the United Kingdom, we expect that about 48% of people in Scotland would have said that they did want to leave the United Kingdom. And many speculate that that could mean that there's a much rockier relationship between Scotland and the rest of the United Kingdom for a while to come, because at least or almost half of their population did want to leave. That's what Minister Salmond is trying to deal with right now. He's trying to ease tensions and say that he's still willing to work with the United Kingdom going forward, even if they don't end up leaving the United Kingdom. Another election that's going on in the next few weeks is the election for Brazil's new president. Now, the New York Times explained on September 16, 2014, that there have been some interesting developments in this race over the past few weeks. First, Dilma Rousseff, who's the incumbent president, she's representing the PT party, which translates to the Workers' Party, and she's currently the incumbent. But what's interesting is her main rival, whose name is Marina Silva, is actually gaining in the polls to a point where she's almost equaling Rousseff when it comes to the major issues, meaning that it could appear that Ms. Rousseff could be forced out of office as a result. Now, Ms. Silva is a former cabinet secretary who's running for the PSB party, that's the Brazilian Socialist Party. She actually replaced her, she was the vice presidential candidate until a few weeks ago when her running mate, Eduardo Campos, who was the Socialist Party's candidate, actually died in a plane crash. Now, many say that that was tragic, but wouldn't have that much of an effect on the election. The fact that Ms. Silva is now leading in the polls in a way that her previous running mate couldn't indicates that she's actually probably a better candidate to challenge Ms. Rousseff, and if it wasn't for that plane crash, as sad as it was, Ms. Rousseff's political future would be much more guaranteed. Now, the issues in the election are namely the sluggish economy and the culture of political corruption that's been fostered under Ms. Rousseff, as well as the anger that's coming from much of the Brazilian population about the extent to which there's been public investment into issues like into venues for the World Cup and the the Summer Olympics, which will be coming in 2016. Many saying that that money could be better invested to try and help the economy and help many of the poor people within Brazil. It begs the question as to whether or not this election will actually serve as a backlash to the Ms. Rousseff's policies and to the Olympics and the World Cup being held in Brazil, and question whether or not Brazil is going to be as fully committed to the Olympics in 2016 if somebody new is elected to be the president. Now, the election in Brazil is on October 5th, and there'll be a runoff election at the end of October if neither candidate actually gets 50% of the vote. We should note that there are about 5 candidates running, so it's possible that it will go to a runoff, but that runoff will likely be between Ms. Rousseff and Ms. Silva, if that actually ends up happening. Moving to the other side of the globe, though, there's actually been some developments when it comes to India, specifically in the province of Kashmir. The New York Times explained to September 15th, 2014, that there's been major flooding in the past week in the Jhelum River, or when the Jhelum River has actually breached its banks and flooded the town of Srinagar, which is in the Kashmir province of India. Now, what's interesting is the government response to the Kashmir province and to the flooding in Kashmir has been incredibly light. In fact, it took about 5 days for the government to get on the ground and begin to provide aid to many of the people in the region, which many see as disturbing and potentially a little bit racist on the part of the Indian government as a result of the tense relationship that India has with the Kashmir region. Now, India fully maintains that Kashmir is a part of India, but India also states pretty point blank that they don't believe, but India, which is a majority Hindu, has had rocky relations with Kashmir, which is a majority Islamic. In other words, there's a very clear religious divide between the majority of India and the Kashmir province. And that's why it's interesting specifically that many reports that the government has been providing assistance to Hindus who are in the region over providing assistance to many of the Islamic neighborhoods are actually igniting lots of religious tension within the entire Kashmir region. As a result, this could prompt many detrimental relationships for India going forward, namely because Pakistan, which is majority Islamic, is coming to the assistance of Kashmir in a much more aggressive way, in fact, threatening India essentially to provide aid to the people of Kashmir if the Indian government won't. This could potentially strain India and Pakistan's relationship in a way that we haven't seen in nearly 20 years, specifically because every time India and Pakistan have had a conflict over really anything, it's been over this Kashmir region. And let's not forget that both India and Pakistan have nuclear weapons, so whenever they have a major disagreement, that's not great for global security. Another interesting thing, though, is let's look at the BJP, which is the newly elected party into the Parliament of India, which was elected back in May. If the BJP is already experiencing numerous cultural backlashes from non-Hindu groups, specifically in Kashmir, it could indicate that the extent of their power is mostly tied to their religion. That's not great for the BJP going forward, given that there's only about 60% of India actually identifies as Hindu, given that there could be some major problems for India and Indian foreign policy, or India domestic policy, going forward, if the BJP is acting in a somewhat controversial manner when it deals with the flooding in Kashmir. And the BJP is appearing to have other stability problems and momentum problems when it comes to other elections that have been held recently in India. In fact, the New York Times explained on September 16, 2014, that most recently the BJP party was running for some local state legislative positions to try and control more state legislators in 3 northern provinces. And in all of those provinces, they were beat on almost a 2-to-1 vote, with their opposition parties, numerous parties, gaining almost twice as many seats as the BJP was actually able to gain in all of these provinces. And interestingly, that includes the Gujarat province, which is actually where the current Prime Minister of India, Narendra Modi, who's a member of the BJP, served as a regional governor for a long period of time. Many say that this could indicate that the BJP is already losing momentum and losing popularity amongst many Indians just months after having won in a landslide election, defeating the ruling party within India. This is interesting then for domestic politics, because if the BJP is already losing control, it could mean that the hope and change that Mr. Modi was promising for India just a few months ago may ultimately not materialize. Speaking about the Southeast Asian region, there's also been substantial instability going on within Afghanistan, something that the United States hasn't really seen in the past few months. The Associated Press explained on September 16, 2014, that a Taliban attacker recently detonated a car bomb next to an international military convoy on Tuesday, which killed 20 troops and was only a few hundred yards from the U.S. Embassy in Kabul. This is interesting then, because it indicates that the United States has been claiming that Afghanistan is stable and that U.S. troops are able to leave by the end of the year. This may indicate that that may not be the case. If a Taliban operative is able to get really into the heart of Kabul and get really close to the U.S. Embassy and other major government buildings in the region, it may indicate that the Taliban is stronger than the United States thinks. And especially when it comes to next spring, when the Taliban is most violent, it could mean that the Taliban could come back in force. And unfortunately, in 2015, theoretically, U.S. troops won't still be there, meaning that we could see much more instability coming out of Afghanistan than was previously expected by President Obama when he laid out a clear timetable for U.S. troop withdrawal from Afghanistan. Another international development that's come in the past week is reported by the Associated Press on September 14th and comes out of North Korea. In fact, they report that the North Korean Supreme Court convicted 24-year-old American Matthew Miller to 6 years of hard labor. Interestingly, this is the second of 3 Americans who have been charged in recent weeks of actually committing treason or to have been convicted by a North Korean court. All 3 of the individuals, one of whom was a missionary and 2 of them were hikers, wandered into North Korea by accident and were then captured by the North Korean government and charged as spies of the United States. If all 3 of them are put in prison, that makes it much harder for the United States to ultimately negotiate with North Korea to get them out, meaning that this should be a situation that's watched closely, also because it may indicate increasing hostility coming out of North Korea if they're now willing to charge many Americans with actual crimes and sentencing them to many years of hard labor in North Korean prisons. That could indicate that Kim Jong-un, the leader of North Korea, is becoming, again, more aggressive towards the United States. Not necessarily something the United States wants, given the number of international crises that are already going on in other parts of the world. Let's now move back to a more domestic front when it comes to news this week. The first news comes from CNN on September 18, 2014, when they explained that California is undergoing 2 major fires that have ultimately prompted Governor Jerry Brown to declare a state of emergency throughout California. The King Fire has currently burnt about 70,000 acres of land in California and is only about 5% contained, whereas there's another smaller Bowles Fire, which is burning in northern California as well, a little bit closer to the border with Oregon, and has destroyed at least 150 structures to date, more likely to be lost overnight, and about 65% of that fire has so far been contained. This may indicate just how great the drought in California has been, and unfortunately, with fire season likely going to last another few weeks at least, these may not be the last fires that California sees. The unfortunate problem that wildfires create, remember, is that in the spring, when there's more snow melt and rain in California, there's going to be an enormous amount of flooding, because if all of the trees and brush have been destroyed, this allows water to flow much more quickly, and we could see more mudslides and flooding come out of in Northern California as a result of these fires. Other domestic news comes from, more specifically, from Washington, where Politico reported on September 15, 2014, that Affordable Care Act plans are found to have violated many of the abortion rules that were ultimately set up in the law back in 2010. Now, the report ultimately talks about a Government Accountability Office report, which explains that about 15 of the 18 insurance plans that are sold on the healthcare.gov website don't meet the abortion provisions that were laid out in the original law that was passed in 2010. Now, it explains that originally there were provisions put in the Affordable Care Act which guarantee that abortion can't be paid for through government subsidies. Essentially, what insurance companies would have to do is they'd have to make 2 separate payments and send 2 separate bills to people who enrolled in these plans. They would get a bill that paid for all of their insurance, or all of their medical coverage, with the exception of abortion. That would be covered by a government subsidy, and then the insurance company would also have to bill the individual specifically for abortion, or in some cases contraception coverage that wasn't going to be provided by the United States government. If these insurance plans, though, aren't complying with these regulations laid out in the 2010 law, this may, unfortunately, for President Obama, provide another indication that, provide another opportunity for many opponents of the Affordable Care Act to sue the law and try and get provisions of it overturned. That's not something that President Obama wants to do, specifically given the possibility of Republicans taking over the Senate very quickly, which could make it much harder for him to make any major changes to the Affordable Care Act whatsoever. And speaking of Republican control, there's been some interesting developments when it comes to Republicans working alongside President Obama when it comes to some of the major issues that they were supposed to deal with during the September recess. Politico explained on September 15, 2014, that we've already seen some compromise come from the Republican Congress when working with President Obama. We talked about how already the House of Representatives has already passed President Obama's bill, which would allow Syrian rebel training camps to be created in Saudi Arabia. But Republicans have also approved the Export-Import Bank Charter, which Democrats expected a major fight over, and they've refunded the government through mid-December. They've passed a new budget, which guarantees that there won't be a government shutdown before the election. Now, there are a few things that we could really take away from this and an indication about how Congress has acted going into the midterm elections. First, this gives Republicans the upper hand because Democrats were really counting on a government shutdown or some other major fight during the September recess that would make the Republicans look a little crazier and give them an upper hand going forward when dealing with or when going into the midterm elections. The fact that that didn't happen then means that President Obama and his congressional Democrats are going to have to run on their own tarnished record, which unfortunately may not bode too well for Democrats. But it also indicates that the new leadership team that Speaker John Boehner has put together actually might be more effective at whipping Republican votes and guaranteeing unanimous Republican support. Remember, when Eric Cantor and Kevin McCarthy were the majority leader in whip, we saw many crises, the last one about a year ago from today, when the government was shut down as a result of infighting between the Tea Party and establishment Republicans over President Obama's Affordable Care Act, or Obamacare. The fact that we aren't seeing that same fight going on today, just a year later, with the exact same Congress, indicates that the new leadership team, which includes Kevin McCarthy now as the majority leader and Steve Scalise as the new House whip, may actually be able to better deal with Tea Party Republicans, keep them more in line, and indicates going forward that Speaker Boehner may have much more control over his caucus than in previous years, which indicates then that we could expect a less volatile House of Representatives after the midterm elections, which, spoiler alert, it looks like Republicans are going to retain control of the House going forward. With that being said, let's talk about elections. Let's start off with Hillary Clinton and some recent moves that she's been making, which again indicate that she's looking at least to run for president in 2016, because we were uncertain of that going forward. Politico explains on September 14, 2014, that Hillary Clinton was the guest of honor at Senator Tom Harkin's steak fry in Iowa, commonly known for the first presidential caucus, and a place where anybody who hopes to run for president should start stumping right about now. Given this, Hillary Clinton has said that she's still thinking about running but hasn't made a full decision, although she again indicated that she would likely announce her decision at the beginning of 2015. This is also, interestingly, the first time that Miss Clinton has actually campaigned either for herself or for other Democrats since 2013 when she was in Virginia campaigning for now Democratic Governor Terry McAuliffe. Interestingly then, Clinton's becoming much more politically active, which of course begs the question whether or not she'll run, and the fact that she's campaigning in Iowa just weeks before she's planning to announce whether or not she'll run for president, I think there's a pretty clear indication as to the answer of that question. Something that's not as clear, though, is who's going to retain control of the Senate in 2014. And interestingly, there have been some developments on that front this past week. The Washington Post explained on September 16, 2014, that in the past few weeks, we've actually seen the Washington Post, the New York Times, and the 538 blog run by Nate Silver, all of which have their own computer and mathematical models to project who will control the Senate. All of those models have indicated that the race for the Senate is tightening. Previously, it appeared inevitable in most of those models that there would be some form of, or that Republicans would retain or would gain control of the Senate. But it appears now that the race is essentially a tie between the two sides. Most models showing that as a result of Mark Udall gaining much more, or doing much better in polls in Colorado, Kay Hagan doing much better, she's the Democrat running in North Carolina, and Bill Braley doing better in Iowa. All of these have indicated that Democrats have a much better chance of actually retaining control of the Senate going forward when it comes to retaining control of the Senate going forward, though it's still estimated that there will be about there's still about a 50% chance that Republicans could retake the Senate, meaning that Democrats certainly shouldn't count their chickens before they've hatched. An interesting article was written for Politico this week, though, on September 15th, when they asked the now rhetorical and theoretical question, what would happen when the GOP actually retakes the Senate? Politico explains on September 15th, 2014, that because of the filibuster, Mitch McConnell wouldn't have anywhere near unanimous control or a greater ability to pass substantial bills that hurt President Obama. But they likely would be able to pass several bills that actually at least limit the Affordable Care Act in some way, likely being able to get some more conservative Democrats on board with those bills. And more interestingly, the Senate, just by having a one-vote majority, Republicans would be able to control every major committee chairmanship in the Senate, which would mean that instantly, not only does the White House have to deal with hearings coming from the House whenever the White House makes any minor screw-up, but now they have to expect the same from the Senate, which means we could see another round of Benghazi, NSA, IRS hearings coming out of the Senate now if Republicans take control in January. Meaning that President Obama does have a very compelling interest going forward to try and keep the Senate Democratic, although we should note that Republicans won't be able to run the table should they gain control of the Senate, because there's no way they'll be able to get the 60 votes for a filibuster-proof Senate in this election. Just to go quickly to a few polls that have come specifically out of Senate races, the first one comes out of New Hampshire, where CNN reports on September 15th, 2014, that the New Hampshire Senate race between Jeanne Shaheen and Scott Brown is now tied at 48% each. This again indicates that New Hampshire may be becoming a toss-up state as well for the Democrats, one which was, at least to have before now, been thought to tentatively have been in the Democratic column. If this becomes a true swing state, then Democrats will have one more state that they have to worry about and have to win if they want to maintain control of the Senate. At the same time, there have been some developments in the Kansas Senate race as well. Remember, this is the race where the Democrat has dropped out in favor of supporting the independent. His name's Greg Orman. Both of them are running against Senator Pat Roberts of Kansas, who's a 6-time incumbent, is trying to run for a 7th term. Politico explains that already we've seen Senators McCain, McConnell, Hatch, and Paul all going into Kansas to try and stump for Roberts, guaranteeing that he has much more establishment support, and they've all been raising money for Roberts as well, which makes it more likely that he'll be able to defeat Orman. But just a few hours ago, the Kansas Supreme Court also ruled that Chad Taylor's name, he's the Democrat who was running for Senate in Kansas, his name can be taken off the ballot, meaning that voters will only be able to choose between Pat Roberts and the independent candidate in Kansas. That ultimately means then that in Kansas then that Pat Roberts is going to have a much harder challenge, because it means now that every Democrat is going to be voting for that independent, which can guarantee that it's essentially still a 2-man race right now in Kansas. Just one of them has a much more broader independent appeal than any Democratic candidate ever could in Kansas. In the Iowa Senate race as well, Representative Bruce Bailey is found, according to Politico, to be outspending pretty substantially his state senator and Republican opponent, Joni Ernst. They report that Ernst has spent about $7 million when it comes to trying to get elected to the Senate, whereas Braley has spent $9.2 million. This is the one state where Democrats are substantially outspending Republicans, and this is what has led many Democrats to say that they have a good chance of winning Iowa going forward just as a result of this spending. Finally, though, the most significant polling that's come as a result of that's come in the past few weeks has come out of the Illinois governor's race, when Governor Pat Quinn has actually pulled ahead. He's the Democrat. Governor Pat Quinn has pulled ahead of his Republican challenger, Bruce Rauner, which is interesting because up until now it appeared that Quinn was going to lose the Illinois Senate or the Illinois gubernatorial race by about 10 percentage points. He now leads by 8 percentage points in the new polling, by 48% to 37% for Rauner. This is an interesting turnaround for Quinn specifically, because it appears to indicate that he's been able to at least overcome some of the perception problems that he's been dealing with going forward. So that's the news of this week. Let's move on to your questions. Now, we have quite a few so far, but we're still accepting tweets at Champion Briefs, or at the Twitter handle @ChampionBriefs. So let's start off actually with, give it a second. Let's start off with, hold up. Yeah, so again, make sure you're continually tweeting out your comments. The handle is @ChampionBriefs specifically. That's where we're going to be able to answer your questions. We'll probably be doing this for another half hour or so going forward. And again, I want to remind you that going forward, when we're talking about a lot of these topics, these are very relevant, but you should remember that you also need to be paying attention to exactly what's going on in the news recently, especially if you're going to be competing at tournaments like Yale this weekend or any other tournaments this weekend. Make sure you're constantly checking the news to see what's up to date. All right, it looks like we can't get our graphics going up, so we're going to, I'm just going to read the questions. I'll make sure I read them a few times and then answer them as we're doing this. So our first question comes from @superquirky_tux. It's a nice Twitter handle. Now the question is, what is your opinion about pulling troops out? What would happen if we did? I'm going to assume that this is talking about Afghanistan as opposed to Iraq, because the United States has already removed the major troop presence in Iraq. And that's a really interesting question. There are, oh, okay. Let's talk about Iraq instead. Okay. When we're talking about Iraq and troops in Iraq specifically, the first thing we want to remember is that in Iraq, the United States definitely would have to have a very substantial military presence in the region if we wanted to actually try and combat ISIS successfully. This means that in Iraq, the United States would have to have a really substantial military presence to make any difference when it comes to dealing with the ISIS militants. And as a result of that, it would pretty much be disadvantageous for the United States to send in such a major troop presence. We'd essentially have to invade Iraq for the third time in the past 20 years. That's definitely not something that's great for a human total for the United States. What's interesting, though, is let's remember that the Senate's now approved the plan to try and train some of the troops try and train some of the Syrian rebels specifically going forward, which means that there is going to be a fighting force on the ground, both in the Iraqi army, the Kurdish army, and now in the Free Syrian army, all of whom will have more resources from the United States to fight Iraq and fight the Islamic State of Iraq and Syria specifically. The interesting question is going to come from when we're asking the question about if that plan fails, what happens next. The fact that President Obama is taking troops off the table does send a sign to many in ISIS that the United States definitely has limits as to what we're willing to do. And it means that President Obama now reneging on that promise could actually undermine U.S. credibility even more. So I think taking troops off the table and making the blanket statement that the United States shouldn't ever use troops in Iraq was probably a mistake for President Obama. But as to whether or not we need to send more troops into Iraq going forward, that's a question that we're going to have to answer. That only time will be able to tell as to whether or not the current strategy President Obama is pursuing was successful, or if we need to actually try and pursue a different strategy going forward. All right, let's see what other questions we have. Okay, this tweet is from @ZSlots, and the question is, how would ISIS likely react to American ground troops in Iraq and Syria, and to what extent would ISIS be crippled? Well, let's remember that, or I'll read it again real quick. So how would ISIS likely react to American ground troops in Iraq and Syria, and to what extent would ISIS be crippled? That's an interesting question. It's certainly true that if the United States were to send in a 2003 size invasion army into Iraq, that we would likely see what happens in Iraq currently, the same as what happened in Afghanistan in 2001, when that country was largely controlled by Taliban militants. The United States would likely be able to displace much of the leadership, would be able to displace much of the leadership of Iraq very quickly. Oh, we got the questions. Perfect. Would likely be able to displace much of the leadership of ISIS and guarantee that it wasn't able to pose a threat to the United States, to Iraq, to Syria. But the question would be, at what cost? Remember, the last time the United States actually the last time the United States was involved in Iraq, we saw over 5,000 troops actually killed in total as a result of the sectarian violence that was caused as a result. And likely, if the United States were to get involved in ISIS again, even if we displaced the leadership of ISIS, there would still be numerous fractious, different, small militant groups who are violently Sunni and still believe in what ISIS believes in. And that could ultimately mean that the United States faces another long-term insurgency or long-term sectarian violence breaking out in Iraq, because we'll see the Shiites in southern Iraq start to fight against the Sunnis and the Sunni extremists who are now currently affiliated with ISIS in the north, which means that the United States, if we sent in troops, would likely be again involved into a long, drawn-out sectarian conflict between the Iraqis, or between the two different groups in Iraq, the Sunnis and the Shiites. And that ultimately means that the United States, going forward, would still have to be involved in this very long-term military conflict, which would galvanize opposition against the United States and make it more likely that terrorist groups might not spring up in Iraq, but that a terrorist group like Al-Qaeda could again use the U.S. presence in Iraq as a reason to recruit more terrorists against the United States, would increase overall anti-American sentiment in the region. So let's move on to our next question, which looks like it's dealing with the Indian elections. Let's give it a second, see if we can pull this one up as well. This question is, how should the U.S. reduce aid to India because of Prime Minister Modi's right-wing nationalism? That's an interesting question as well. Now, it's multifaceted. Let's remember that the United States certainly has a very strong trading relationship with India, and the United States taking any substantial action to try and reduce any assistance or to really in any way move away from Prime Minister Modi would certainly be interpreted as a hostile action on the part of the United States, and would likely see India moving further away from the United States, with substantially harming the U.S. economy. That's not something that we want to deal with specifically. Now, looks like this is a bill in outrounds for Yale, so again, congressional debaters specifically, let's pay attention. Now, Modi definitely has a history of hyper-nationalism and anti-Islamic sentiment, but if the BJP is losing steam, this may mean that the United States doesn't actually have to take that substantial action. The BJP is going to be in power for the next few years in India, at least until the next round of parliamentary elections. But if Mr. Modi is actually losing steam, it's unlikely that he'll actually be able to gain substantial support for many of his policies, which are actually going to be violently anti-Islamic or violently pro-Hindu in any way. As a result of that, it's unlikely that Mr. Modi will be able to do much, because let's remember how a parliamentary government system works specifically. The Prime Minister is going to have to call for a new election the instant the vote of no confidence. The instance that somebody disagrees with him, or a majority of the parliament disagrees with him, which means that if a substantial number of people feel that Mr. Modi is acting too extreme, like many expect, then we'll actually see more instability, probably a vote of no confidence for Mr. Modi, and new elections, which means that fortunately, India's parliamentary system can actually probably keep Mr. Modi and like any extremism he may be pursuing in that. Let's also remember, though, that Mr. Modi is visiting the United States at the end of the month, where Mr. Obama and Mr. Modi are going to be discussing several issues, so there certainly could be a topic that's discussed then. That's probably a better plan for the United States going forward right now, because if the United States is able to at least work diplomatically with Mr. Modi, send a message that the U.S. isn't as willing to work, or that the United States isn't as willing to back India if they're going to be ultimately more right-wing, then the United States could communicate this through diplomatic means, soft power, as opposed to having to use a relatively hard form of power in cutting off all assistance to India. Plus, let's remember, India is, again, a nuclear power. They're pretty antagonistic to Pakistan, and the United States definitely needs allies when it comes to countering certain Taliban extremism, when it comes to Pakistan, guaranteeing there's more stability in Pakistan. And it's, again, really been U.S. policy to maintain decent relationships with both of these countries to guarantee that neither Pakistan nor India decides to launch a nuclear weapon at the other. So again, the U.S. cutting ties dramatically from India is probably going to be more harmful than beneficial in the long term, at the very least because India's in. All right, let's move to our next question. And give it a second. What? Okay, so the question is from @Hannah Hunter. And the question is, could we incentivize private companies and NGOs to help find a cure to Ebola? That's a really interesting question, actually. So let's start off with understanding exactly how the entire Ebola crisis works, or has worked so far. So let's remember, the Ebola virus has really spread in 3 major countries. That's the countries of Guinea, Sierra Leone, and Liberia. That's where the major outbreaks have occurred, though there's a few cases that have shown up in Nigeria. There's a few actions that the United States could take to incentivize more development of the Ebola drug, but let's remember a few things. First, remember, there is currently the ZMapp drug, which is used by the United States, or which has been used by the United States to at least treat Americans when they've been infected with Ebola. We've seen this drug actually working in the past, which means that if this drug actually is successful at fighting Ebola, then that ultimately isn't necessary because the drug has already existed, and as a result of ZMapp having been tested during this Ebola crisis, will actually be likely approved by the FDA on a much faster timetable than it otherwise would have been, meaning that that could be the silver bullet that ultimately allows us to fight Ebola. But with regards to the government actually incentivizing NGOs or private companies to developing a cure for Ebola, that would be difficult in the current crisis. And that's because we need to understand the geopolitical relationships that exist between the three countries that are most decimated by Ebola and the United States. Now remember, all of these countries are allies with the United States on paper, but they aren't super willing to cooperate with the United States in every instance. Now, the number one reason is there's a really bad rumor going around in a lot of these countries which says that the Ebola crisis was started by the United States government as an attempt to try and experiment on the people of Africa. Now, obviously that's untrue, but as a result of poor communication on behalf of the United States and the international community, there's a lot of hostility towards many in this region currently towards the United States, which means that it's right now really hard for the United States government itself to get biological samples from people who have been infected with Ebola in the first place, because many of the governments are suspicious of the U.S. government's intentions. They likely would be much more suspicious if private companies located in the United States began to request that biological data, meaning that private companies probably isn't the best idea for them to work outside of what the United States government is currently doing, because that would likely destabilize the Ebola crisis more and threaten U.S. relations when it comes to working with these three countries going forward after the Ebola crisis is over. Now, when we're talking about NGOs, we're talking about also pretty difficult because the United States isn't actually controlling the entire Ebola crisis. It's actually being the coordination for the international effort being coordinated by the World Health Organization. That means that any agency who actually wants to work in any of these three countries to fight Ebola has to be approved by the World Health Organization. And if you're not a government, that process could take up to 6 months. As a result of that, it's pretty unfeasible for many global governments, or for many NGOs, excuse me, to fight Ebola successfully, because they're going to take so much time just getting approved by the World Health Organization that by the time they got on the ground to try and develop drugs and get biological samples and stuff like that, the crisis could be over. The final thing we want to remember when it comes to developing this cure is I'm talking a lot about what's going on in the countries that are affected by Ebola, because you can't successfully develop an Ebola drug if you're not actually on the ground. So again, for private companies, for NGOs, it appears much less likely that they'll actually be able to find this cure to Ebola because of the geopolitical situation that currently exists between the United States and between these countries, and because if they don't have access to these countries and to treatment in these countries, they won't actually be able to find a cure to Ebola. So that's all the questions we have time for today. Let's see if we can get this. So we want to thank everybody for actually watching my inaugural, our second overall broadcast of Champion Briefs News. Just a few reminders. We're excited to offer in-depth analysis of the Yale Seminole and Finals legislation, which is going to be presented by the Tournament of Champions champion and NSDA Nationals champion, Will Mascaro. These videos are going to be available on the Champion Briefs website later tonight. You can watch them actually for free by visiting our blog, which actually has a lot of other great resources for all events, including congressional debate. Now, to access all of these analysis videos, you can visit Champion Briefs store, click on quote or the indication which says Access Videos, and under Congressional Debate and Extemporaneous Speaking, and you can get all of this by visiting, again, our website, championbriefs.com. That's all the news for today. Make sure you check out Will Mascaro's videos. Those are going to be great. But for me, for now, I'm Joe Russell. That's the news. And for those of you watching the NFL game tonight, go Falcons. Have a great night, everyone.